My name is Tim Schroeder, and I'll be moderating the session this afternoon. We've got a diverse panel with a terrific set of expertise. We're going to be focused on next generation cell and gene therapy in the oncology space specifically, and we're really going to take the task of lessons learned from some of the recent approvals or some of the later stage products. And so we've got 4 or 5 topics that we'll ask each of the panelists if they've got a thought or an opinion to weigh in on. And then we'll last several minutes. We'll take some questions or comments from the audience. So we'll start with that. So I'd like to have the panel start just with an introduction of themselves and briefly their organization. So Rachel, if you'd like to start.
Absolutely. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Rachel Haurwitz. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Caribou Biosciences. Caribou is a CRISPR gene editing company based in Berkeley, California. And we've developed a new next generation gene editing platform that's quite a bit more specific than the first generation. And using that technology, we are now developing allogeneic CAR T-cell therapies for various different cancer indications. So we're still at a preclinical stage, very excited about the progress that's being made by the field. And specifically where our technology can take us because of the increased specificity is the ability to do multiplex editing. And so our cell therapies will have multiple defined genetic changes. So not only deleting the T-cell receptor in order to make the healthy donor-derived cells allogeneic, and the need to site-specifically insert the CAR locus, the CAR into a specific locus, I should say, but also the ability to make other defined changes within the genome of these cells to improve persistence and otherwise alter the phenotype of the therapy.
Thanks, Rachel. We'll move to Maria.
Hi, good afternoon. It feels a little redundant. I was just here giving a talk about the company. Some of you might have heard me talk. I'm CEO and president at Iovance Biotherapeutics. We are a cell therapy company where we use autologous individual patient cells for treatment of solid tumors. We are a clinical stage program. We have a number of studies in phase 2. Our programs in melanoma is the furthest along, and it's based on a lot of data that Steve Rosenberg at NCI had generated, which we then proceeded to license. Based on that, we have also started a cervical cancer study, which is, he had shown beautiful deep responses in a portion of the patients years out after one-time administration of TIL, which is tumor infiltrating lymphocyte, which is our product. We also are looking into head and neck as well as non-small cell lung cancer indications. In most of our ongoing studies, we are looking at late-line patients, although now we are moving into earlier-line patients in combination with anti-PD-1. We are also expanding the platform technology into indications such as ovarian and sarcoma through collaboration with MD Anderson. As I noted, we are sort of a late-stage company. We are public. We have access to a lot of different manufacturing productions, including CMOs in US and EU, and our programs are both in US and EU being conducted. We have optimized our manufacturing process to a 22-day process with over 90% success rate and a cryopreserved product that we administer into patients. Based on our progress, we are now in a stage where we are talking to various health authorities and defining a registration path for commercializing our product. Thank you.
Thank you. David.
So my name is David Moss, and I am co-founder of a company called Immune Bio, located here in La Jolla, California. We call ourselves Immune Bio because we're focused exclusively on the innate side of the immune system, and we have 2 product platforms that are in the clinic. The first is called InBio3, which is focused on the tumor microenvironment. We're very concerned about, you can have the best T cell in the world, but if you're running into that tumor microenvironment shield, you're going to have issues. So we're very focused on downregulating the tumor microenvironment, and that product is in phase 1. The second product that we have is focused on NK cells. We're focused around the failure of immune surveillance and what goes wrong there. And there's a lot of signaling involved that we understand, and we have a product about priming NK cells so they can resume the function of immune surveillance. And hopefully it's a very good project for cleaning up residual disease. So our company is small, we're private, with 2 products in the clinic, and we hope to potentially look towards the public markets at some time in the future.
Thanks, David. Jeff, last but not least.
Sure, I was actually excited to see David on the panel because the first set of people were all very accomplished PhDs, and I thought I didn't know why I was on the panel.
Thank you.
So thank you for...
Likewise.
Yeah. And maybe you're going to talk circles around me, I don't know.
No.
Like everybody else. But excited to be a part of this panel. Thanks for asking. Bluebird Bio, I'm the Chief Financial and Strategy Officer for the company. We're a company that is focused on gene and cell therapy. We've got really 3 major platforms that we've leveraged over the years: gene therapy, cell therapy, and a gene editing platform as well. We are a late-stage clinical, arguably pre-commercial company now, with 4 clinical programs, 3 of which are intended to be registration trials. And one of them is in oncology. The other 3 are in severe genetic diseases, are targeting various severe genetic diseases. We're now a global company, or are becoming a more global company, I should say. We have 650 plus employees, probably going to be somewhere around 800 by year end. And we have a European presence now, as we're gearing up for a potential launch in Europe with our thalassemia program, targeting transfusion-dependent thalassemia, or patients with transfusion-dependent thalassemia. We, again, are moving toward commercial, which may have some relevance for the panel, even though it's not in oncology. We're experiencing a lot of the same things that some of the oncology products have faced. We haven't quite gotten there, but certainly some early learnings from that as we try to set up the commercial infrastructure. And on the oncology side, our partnership with Celgene is the anchor program targeting multiple myeloma. It's a BCMA-targeted CAR-T. There are 2 programs, 2121 and 21217, which is a fast follower, both of which are in the clinic. The former is in a pivotal trial called KARMA. There are also 2 other trials that have recently gone up on clinicaltrials.gov for that program for earlier lines of therapy. The first one is in relapse refractory patients, and the other 2 trials are intended to pursue third line and then a high-risk second line trial as well. And then on the research side, on the oncology business, we've embarked upon trying to pull together what we think are the best and brightest in the field, at least as it relates to our approach to things. And so we've done a number of major collaborations around technologies that we think are going to set us up, hopefully, for a pretty robust pipeline going forward into the oncology space. And we can certainly talk about those at a later time, but pretty excited about the progress on the preclinical side.
Thanks, Jeff. Well, I think you can see we've got a diverse group, public-private. We've got preclinical all the way to late-stage clinical and close to commercialization. So I think we'll see a lot of different viewpoints here. In reflecting on the topic that the ARM team gave us, I was thinking to myself, we have about 30 to 35 clinical programs that my firm CTI is involved in managing. And if there's one variable that seems to almost always impact timelines, it's on the manufacturing and supply chain side of things. And so I thought we'd start that particular discussion going here. And for the panelists, if you could jump in, especially how has your thinking changed over the last year or 2 in looking at lessons learned from some of these programs that are ahead of us? So I don't know who would like to start here, but
I can start.
Go right ahead, Maria.
I think it's been a great couple of years to see. 2 years ago, when I took the position back then at Lion Biotech, when I told my peers and coworkers and friends in Bay Area that I'm working on cell therapy, they were thinking science fiction, this is never going to happen. And here we are, only 2 years later, with 2 cell therapies in the market. There was a lot of, I have no doubt, there was a lot of hard work, a lot of tenacity, a lot of pursuit and problem solving that was involved, but it's been a great 2 years to see what these 2 companies have accomplished. They've solved a lot of problems. They've solved commercial problems, supply chain problems, distribution problems, reimbursement issues, the payers discussions, how to address a product being located in a certain hospital if the hospital doesn't have the infrastructure that possibly they need. So they have opened a lot of doors. And I think they have opened doors both on the regulatory side, on the clinical side, on the distribution side. It has helped immensely to some degree to see how they approach the problem Their problems are not identical to ours. We certainly have a different type of a product, but that thinking that has gone along with it has been wonderful. It also has allowed for a lot of suppliers to come into the marketplace when there wasn't any maybe 10 years ago. The chain of identity for a product, for example, we collaborate obviously very closely with providers. This is not a CMO level distribution. So back in the days, Dendreon, when they took their first cell therapy to the market, they had to devise all this homebrew products and try and figure out how they're going to distribute their product. So a lot of this time is now. This is a great time to be in cell therapy because some of the problems have been solved. A great deal is before us, but they're not insurmountable. And I think that's the beauty of where we are. So I'm very encouraged, actually.
Well, certainly with your 4 clinical programs spread across multiple continents, you're having to deal with this on a daily basis.
We do. Yeah, we do.
Yeah, I can only agree. I mean, I think that Kymriah and Yescarta proved the cell therapy modality. It's not science fiction anymore.
Agree.
Right.
And I think clinicians understand that. I think technology developers understand that. People across the whole value chain understand that. And I also think some of the challenges that they are now facing as they've gone commercial with these therapies are helping to focus the next generation of companies like ours in terms of where to go next. What are the next hurdles to much more broadly bring these types of therapies to the patients who need them? And I think manufacturing is the first place that conversation starts. It's not the only part of the conversation, but it's clearly an important one. I think timelines are something that people talk a lot about, and obviously those timelines will continue to improve, but there's nothing like having something banked and off the shelf already from a timing perspective. But I think we're also seeing the significant challenge that comes from one patient, one dose, and what that looks like from a scale-up perspective. And no doubt Bluebird and others are bringing a lot to the table on that front. But I do think it's helping to focus a lot of the next generation of cell therapy developers for where to go next, what those next hurdles are.
So go ahead. Go ahead, Dave.
So, I'm also blown away by the success that has happened in the cell therapy business. When I started, actually very early on in the 2000s, there was a cell therapy business that we were involved with as an investor, and they just didn't even have chain of custody rules at the FDA. The data was phenomenal, but there was no way to really produce the product and get approval through the FDA. I mean, every single dose was its own GMP manufacturing facility. And I'm really astounded at how far we've come in terms of being able to produce these types of products. It's still low volume, and it's still high cost. And I think that when you look at designing these products in the future, a lot more work needs to be thought about process engineering and how you're going to be able to get to 1,000 or 10,000 doses a month or something like that. But I'm very excited about what's happening in the business. I agree.
I am equally as excited to be a part of this evolution and this kind of new threshold that we're crossing. I think the challenges are incredibly real on the access side, not pricing reimbursement, but just gaining broad access for patients as we move into these larger volumes. We haven't really been tested yet as a field at all. And it's amazing when and I'm sure a lot of you have sat down and talked to some of the providers that are now in the field, and they're grappling with all these new issues. I was talking to somebody the other day who knows this quite well, who was saying, there's a lot of paper-based stuff out there right now because these systems don't exist for these type of products predominantly, especially at scale. And so we're, I think, all at the infancy of trying to figure this out. And you've seen the bumps that the field has gone through. We'll figure them out. I'm confident that there's so much energy, so much great clinical data, so much promise for the patients that now the money for the support companies is starting to flow in and will continue to flow in. That's the exciting part. I think when we think about some of the experiences in preparing for a potential launch in Europe, there are a few things that come to mind. For us, we think about it in two ways. One, prepare the market, and then the other one is prepare the company. And when you think about preparing the market, this is all that the COE engagement, Center of Excellence engagement, and in autologous gene therapy, obviously, that COE and that patient and the product are effectively all one. And so the systems to be able to manage that patient through the process and the cells through the process and the family through the process is incredibly crazy complex. And we're facing that right now, having to really face up to all the things that we have to have in place that aren't paper-based, that they have to be systematic when we get to larger volumes.
So that whole chain of custody that you described, I think, often gets overlooked when people come up with a program. And I think that a lesson learned is to start the process engineering earlier.
Yeah, and then there's just the volume side, and I think suspension is going to be a big part of the evolution of this field and getting the lentiviral vectors to a point where we can scale them to reach these large populations of cancer patients. We're not there yet. I know there's a lot of progress across a lot of companies, including Bluebird, but we have to make leaps there as well to start scaling up to the hundreds and more liter suspension batches. So it is exciting. It's early, and there's still a ton of learnings that we have to go through.
You know, Jeff, I applaud your efforts. You know, when I think in terms of Novartis or Gilead, they obviously have global footprints already. And so yourselves and our friends at Spark, you know, you're breaking ground in two areas simultaneously, and neither of which are easy independently, but doing it together, you know, I think is particularly challenging. So I think it is as a audience that's largely made up of small and mid-sized companies, you're sort of our champions to show how this can be done.
So you're basically saying don't screw it up. Pretty much. Thanks.
Yeah.
And Maria, I thought interesting comment, you bringing up the Provenge experience. You know, somehow this society, I think we don't, it's old news, and you know, there's no lessons to be learned from it. And you know, I stumbled across something recently where they have about $400 million in sales, I think, in Provenge now, which I think we were promised several billion back in the day, but you know, that's a legitimate commercial you know, a product that obviously is treating patients and having success, and is one we can certainly learn from.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that we shouldn't forget where we all came from. They broke new ground, and I think that even failures that they might have experienced along the way is a lesson for us to learn. In fact, we have a number of former Dendreon team members, and I targeted them when we were, you know, interviewing. We were looking for team members. I thought, look, these people learned something along the way. Some things worked and some things didn't. The fresh product in and out was something that we learned a lesson from. So that was top of the list very early on for us to make sure that we have a cryopreserved product to be shipped out the door. So those are things that we learned, and I think we have to make sure we also give credit to the people that went through the process. They opened a lot of doors. It was very painful for the first product out, but they solved a lot of problems for the subsequent companies to come. Yeah.
Tim, can I make just one more comment as it relates to the dialogue here? One of the other things that I think we've really focused on and hadn't focused on in the beginning, it's this concept of prepare the market, prepare the company. Everybody's focused on preparing the market because they're obvious. You have to get the education out there. You got the systems out there. You've got to get all the infrastructure and understanding of the flow of both the patient and the cells. But preparing the company is equally as important. And that's not a comment about culture. That's a big part of it too, as we all think about growing our companies. But it really is about systematic things like how do you do transfer pricing in this new world? It's very different when you think about having to process cells, sometimes across the pond. When you think about revenue recognition issues, it's very, very complex in an accounting world that's constantly changing in front of us. So you throw an accounting world that's constantly changing and the complexity of this system. So the aspect of getting the company ready to, these platform systems that you have to put in place to be able to manage the whole process from start to finish is equally as important. And I would say that we probably didn't start that early enough. We started the market engagement very early by design. That's a piece that I think a little bit of a lesson learned. I wish we had started a little earlier. I think we're okay, but for sure, but it could have been done earlier.
Let me ask you a question. When did you know you were going to take the product on your own? Because so many small companies just partner and let somebody else deal with all that headache, right?
Yeah, the easy answer is that there wasn't anybody that added value to the process, quite frankly, because it's not established. So either we get income in for somebody else to figure it out, or we find a way to raise capital elsewhere and do it ourselves and keep all the learnings internally. That was where, when we knew we could raise capital, we flipped immediately to we'd rather learn and keep those learnings in-house because we also had subsequent products to leverage beyond that.
Well, kudos for you. I mean, I think that's a great thing that you're taking a product on your own. Not many biotech companies do that.
It's scary.
I know.
It's very scary.
I'm glad. I want to learn from you.
I echo that quite a bit, actually.
Yeah.
Just to change the discussion a little bit, I want to move maybe to the regulatory side of things. And if you look at the recent approvals with the Novartis and the Kite Gilead products, obviously heme malignancies and very narrow indications. I'm wondering, based on those successes and based on a very competitive space, have any or all four of you changed your expectations about your regulatory pathways? Certainly some are at different stages here and some have multiple products, et cetera, but has that influenced your thinking about indication? Has it influenced your thinking about timelines, financing, cost, things like that? And I'll throw it open to whoever wants to start the discussion here.
I can start again.
Yeah.
You guys are awfully quiet. It didn't change our process. The program that we started, at least at Iovance, as long as I've been here, was started around 2 years some ago when I joined. I came in with this clear plan. What it did, however, though, is very much boosted my confidence that it is executable, because FDA was being particularly open-minded about a single-arm study, for example, as a strategy with very late-line patients. On top of that, they lowered the bar on a couple of things which really allowed access to these very, very critical products reaching the market. They changed their view on biostatistical intent to treat analysis, for example. They allowed for a single-arm study to be considered for a full approval. These are groundbreaking spaces. They always accepted a fantastic product to be considered as a single-arm study for registration, but that would have been an accelerated approval. A full approval typically would have had some sort of a post-marketing commitment that either would have had to get started prior to submission or at least subsequent to submission. So CBER specifically was very, very open-minded, very collaborative with the companies, and I think that we have been very pleased with the doors that it appears that CBER is opening to try and allow for life-saving medicines to reach the market. They also, I think, recognize that in the field of cell therapy and gene therapy, this is not the same landscape where you could do a single-arm study, but you don't have to do 200 patients, which was the pattern that, again, the agency was setting with products such as Keytruda or nivolumab. They allowed for all of that to proceed, but their sample sizes were large. So what they did here, they allowed for a smaller sample size, they allowed for different statistical evaluation, they allowed for a different label and indication. It was a very open-minded approach to try and bring a product to the patients as soon as possible. So we were very pleased with the progress that was made as part of these labels. I remember the first day when either of the products got approved, first Kymriah was approved, the day label was released, all of us were pouring over it to say, so what did they do? And it was exactly what we thought they were going to do. It was fantastic to see. So I think, again, I'm encouraged.
Maybe I'll add just a comment. I think Novartis and Kite and Gilead, obviously subsequently, and then others to follow, deserve a huge amount of credit for being pioneers in this field, in the oncology space in particular, and really testing the system. This seemingly new regulatory tone that we hear, particularly in the U.S., they were testing the resolve of these type of transformative therapies and the willingness to engage in maybe a different way around getting these to patients in a broader and maybe even more rapid way. So I think that set the stage for all of us to be able to have different conversations potentially with the agencies around endpoints, around speed, around creative trials. And certainly what they've also done is created an incredibly competitive environment for all of us, which is good and bad. You see it in BCMA, the amount of competition is quite remarkable. And so that also pushes the creativity within companies, that competitive nature of how to run these trials in a creative way that keeps the patient obviously at the center and safety foremost, but allows potentially for thinking about different populations of patients and how to enter by targeting high-risk patients, for example. So I think to me, that's what they've done, is they've created this open door and an incredibly competitive environment that allows companies now, it forces companies to be more creative in the way they think about approaching these markets.
Yeah, I think part of what we're seeing is such dramatic timelines, right? We look at how quickly both of these therapies were approved, and the fact that really it was fundamentally off of pivotal phase 2 data. You can now look at some of the new therapies that are being pushed into the clinic and put together a timeline that is incredibly aggressive but achievable based on what these programs went through, that is incredible for patients, absolutely feeds into the competitive landscape that you're describing, and I think actually really challenges some of the funding and financing models and challenges some of the manufacturing models. Companies will not have the long timelines that they're used to having for when to make certain go, no-go decisions, when to raise certain types of capital, when to invest in their own manufacturing if that's part of the process. These timelines are massively collapsed, and so there's a lot more that can or could be done at risk. And I think understanding how to tell that story, whether it's as a private company or as a public company, will be a new part of this challenge and a new part of the opportunity that's afforded by the understanding of the FDA and their willingness to really work with companies to advance these novel therapies.
I wonder, Rachel, just to follow up on that though, and it's sort of this was where I was trying to steer this conversation. You know, are those timelines and are those study sizes reproducible? Meaning, have we now set a bar or an expectation? You know, we have a lot of sponsors that will come to us at a very early stage preclinical, take an example of something that's already through to approval or close to it and say, that's now the expected norm. I think I can do a smaller study, or I think I can skip these 2 phases and go right to this. You know, in some ways, I mean, I think you said it well, as the regulatory authorities, you know, viewed these as unique, and I think the question will become as more and more of them move into the clinic and through the clinic, are we going to stretch the resources, and will these suddenly be treated like other drugs, biologics, things, et cetera, and not get special consideration? And I'm just wondering if anybody's thought that direction or if that's maybe premature.
So I have an opinion. I don't think FDA is giving in. I don't think that's what they're doing. I think that they still hold their minimum bar. What they look at, and they've always done this, they look at risk benefit. They look at your patient population and they look at if there's absolutely no available therapy, then they open the doors for you. This was always the case. Cedar did this actually in heme, starting with, you know, PI3K inhibitors as well as, you know, BTK inhibitors. So this theme started about 5, 6 years ago, 7 years ago, where FDA started thinking, look, we got to get additional products in addition to chemotherapy, more targeted therapies to patients in cancer. And you know, cancer is, as people have a better life expectancy, this is becoming a bigger and bigger problem. So the agency has been open-minded. I don't think CBER lowered their bar. What they did is they looked at risk-benefit of the patients that these particular products were addressing. And I think that you're correct, that as we go forward, I don't think the bar is going to get lower. I think as the next product comes in and the next product comes in, if they're just another Me Too in the same indication, the bar is going to go right back to where it was, because the guidances are there. The guidances are very clearly there. You need a randomized study if there's available care. But if you're addressing an unmet medical need and the patients have no alternatives, then you're in a different path.
Yeah, we first tested that in relapsed refractory.
Yeah,
so the relapsed refractory is the one where clearly there's a significant unmet need.
Totally agree.
And those are generally smaller trials.
Yeah.
You're not comparing against another therapy typically.
Yeah.
But as they move up in lines of therapy where there are very effective therapies, the trials get bigger. You potentially are going head-to-head versus standard of care. And the agencies will require that because of the risk-benefit relative to standard of care. So I agree, they're not changing the standards. They're thinking more creatively about these type of transformative therapies. And it's the transformative benefit of all the therapies that are out there that's forcing the dialogue more than anything, I think.
Other point I wanted to just highlight here, and a couple different experiences. Any thoughts on the geographies? I mean, David, I know you've got programs in Australia and the UK. You chose those for reasons. You mentioned, Maria, your 4 programs are Europe and North America. I think, Jeff, in your case, you're virtually everywhere, I think, if I recall, from Thailand to Turkey and everywhere in between. Any opinions, thoughts, or changes in your view of where these studies should be conducted, or which regulatory authorities need to be negotiated with early or more frequently?
Well, we went to those locations for a number of different reasons. Primarily because we're a small biotech company, there's rebate programs that are available in both those countries that we're able to access. Also, our study in INBO3, which is to downregulate the myeloid-deprived suppressor cell, which is a major indicator for resistance to checkpoint inhibitors. Australia was ground zero for checkpoint inhibitors. I think when we say, immunotherapy today, checkpoint inhibitors are a big part of that. They're really what we consider immunotherapy. So we started in those jurisdictions for that reason. And I can't really comment on the previous question that you had answered earlier, Tim, because I'm probably the only company up here that doesn't have a CAR product. But when we drive our studies, even at an early stage, we really drive them with biomarkers. We want to make sure that we've got good biomarkers in place, even at an early stage, to kind of either adjust what we're doing or honestly, to have a capital commitment that says, hey, enough is enough, early stage. So I think that's important in terms of this clinical design. And then when you come back to the FDA with human data from those locations which are well respected, I think that the FDA is much more willing to have discussions with you about continuing. So that's been kind of our plan and our goal.
Maybe real quick comment on how we ended up in the regions. That entrance into the Europe and beyond Europe, and including Asia, was really driven predominantly by the regulatory path we were afforded, the Adaptive Pathways Program in Europe for the thalassemia program. So we went into Europe first as it relates to potential regulatory path, speed to approval. Knock on wood that continues to be favorable or look favorable. But the Adaptive Pathways afforded us that opportunity. And from there, you were able to access patients from different regions close to Europe. So Thailand has a large population of thalassemia patients. And so we used that as an anchor and then expanded from there. For the oncology business, it was a relatively simple answer: Celgene. So they've got an infrastructure that is global that we're tapping into. So that's not something that Bluebird built. That is a Celgene machine that exists out there, in particular with regard to multiple myeloma, that you can't replicate in any reasonable period of time, if ever. And so the global nature of our oncology trials are solely a product of Celgene's infrastructure and expertise.
Thanks.
We had a strategy why we picked Europe. Our goal was to use the same type of studies for both regions. The patient population is very similar, standard of care is very similar, the approval and adoption of checkpoints. By the way, we are not a CAR company, we are a TIL company. No problem. So we selected it carefully, hoping that the study that we would run, you'd run one study and it could be acceptable in both regions. It also was fortuitous that there's wonderful cell therapy manufacturing organizations in Europe with very similar standards. There's less barrier for language and tech transfer, and our team members are able to travel. There's also a realistic approach for us, which is the financials. At this point, we're about $1 billion plus minus 200, 300, up or down company. We have about 80, 85 employees. So there's no way we can go global without limitation. We only have so many FTEs as we do. So our top priority, of course, was US. Once we got US up and running, then our next priority is EU. And we're active in EU in multiple 6 countries in various studies. But as we get more momentum, as we get better financial support, as we get more FTEs, we certainly would look into expanding in other regions. So it's just a matter of time. But we are not as well resourced and staffed to be able to do it all at the same time.
David, you brought up the biomarker point. I wonder if the panel has any suggestions for people that are in the process of designing new programs, surrogates, biomarkers. Where's their role in a rapidly evolving field like the cell and gene platforms that we're in? It seems like in some divisions at FDA, the promise of utilizing those has been realized faster than others. Anybody have any stories to share or suggestions here?
So we drove it because we needed to manage our trials at an early stage to get data. Also because we're doing them overseas, we wanted to come back to the FDA with some sort of efficacy. We felt that was very, very important. When you say immunotherapy is all about obviously modulating the immune system. And the way we look at it, even though we call ourselves an immunotherapy company, is we're really an immune company. We want to be able to look into the patient's innate side of the immune system, say, hey, look, this is right, this is wrong, we believe we can fix this, fix that. And if we can do that, then maybe other immunotherapies might work better, or maybe the body's own immune system might do the job it was supposed to do in the first place. And so we have a lot of biomarkers in the immune system, fortunately, that we're able to use. And we spent a lot of time developing assays and tests and so on beforehand, before we even started the trials, so that we could get these tests, or fortunately some of the tests were available third party. So I think it's a smart decision for a small company. I'm certainly the smallest one on the panel, that's resource constrained to do something like that, because obviously value in a biotech company is driven 100% by data.
Yeah, I might take your question and go in a slightly different direction. I think one of the new challenges that many groups in the allogeneic field will face is how you actually identify the best donors and the best donor cells, and understanding how you characterize and phenotype the donor, him or herself, the cells themselves, the genotype, or other characteristics, and how that's built into the manufacturing pipeline. I think that's work that a lot of us are doing right now, and no doubt will be really important for our manufacturing schemes.
And to follow up on that, Rachel, how do you, moving into the clinic as rapidly as possible, but at the same time trying to make that optimal, where does that decision point, how does that get reached, or what are those discussions like?
Yeah, great question. I wish it were so easy as just those two pieces that we had to stitch together. Obviously, it's a balance of a lot of different components. And I think clinical data is always the holy grail, right? But we have to do that in a way that we believe is the safest, best product we can put together. And so it's a ridiculous balancing act of trying to pull all these components together, understanding that some of them fundamentally we won't truly be able to measure or characterize until we are in the clinic. And so again, really keeping safety as our primary driver, and doing the best we can on a number of these fronts simultaneously.
On the safety topic, I wanted to throw that out to the panel. With these small clinical development programs and products being approved or cleared, sometimes with only a few dozen patients, obviously agencies, FDA, EMA, others are requiring long-term follow-up of these first study patients, and then many of the initial commercial patients having to be rolled in. Anybody have any thoughts or particular guidance they'd like to suggest, or ways they're thinking about trying to assess long-term safety when you've got such small numbers of subjects being treated?
I can take that one. For us, I think it was a little easier, and we are benefiting from the work that Dr. Rosenberg did. He has been dosing patients for over decades at this point. So there's a lot of long-term follow-up data, and we know what the patients will do over time. And again, because it's non-genetically modified product, it was a little easier to address it. But I very much echo what you're saying, because as we are modifying our cells for our next generation products, we think about this all the time. We think about what is a good preclinical model. How do we understand what this product may do in humans? Specifically with TIL being an autologous product, it's very hard to have a very good preclinical model. So earlier there was a discussion with one of the FDA members, and they were encouraging sponsors not only to do a pre-IND, but pre-IND, and just having a very casual dialogue. That is incredibly helpful. That's incredibly helpful, because we really could go down a rabbit hole for a long time trying to figure out what is your preclinical model, how much tox do you do, and they're all irrelevant because the product is a cell that is a human cell. So I think this needs to be very much a partnership going forward. I do appreciate that the agency is opening doors to have that dialogue earlier on, and we are ultimately all for patient safety. Nobody wants to do any harm to any patients. So it's a real issue. I'd love to hear our other panel members, how do you think about, if you are genetically modifying a product, how do you think about your safety preclinically if you don't know where to start? How do you do it?
So, well, we don't genetically modify products, so I can't answer that question. But one thing I'll point out is that we work on the innate side of the immune system. The innate side of the immune system is just much simpler. It doesn't have all this complex cytokine storm and CRS issues that you see on the adaptive side. And so our safety is usually driven by high DLT type tests. I mean, our drug hasn't even reached a DLT, which the FDA doesn't like, but it's just a much simpler, we're playing a much simpler sandbox than you do, which is a beauty of, I think, part of the innate immune system. And our feeling is that there's a lot of animal models also on the adaptive side of the immune system. That's probably where most of the research, well, certainly most of the research and dollars have gotten. And the downside is there's just not a lot of animal models on the innate side of the immune system, so it's hard to do preclinical work, right? So I'm sorry, but I really can't answer.
No, that's great. Thank you.
Yeah.
How did you start?
Well, it took a lot of bravery on behalf of the patients and on behalf of the regulators, quite frankly, early on, because there weren't great animal models. I think we're developing more and more as we get more clinical experience, more animal models that may or may not be predictive, but at least we're investing in it. Not we, but I mean as a field.
Yeah.
But frankly, in the very beginning, it just took bravery.
Yeah.
And that's what created the opportunity now to see that clinically and evaluate it clinically, and then building a database that persists for a long time. It's the reason, obviously, that we have to follow these patients for 15 years by requirement. And this actually feeds into an interesting discussion that I know some other panels had on real-world evidence and moving from the preclinical safety to the clinical safety to now the commercial realities, limited number of patients and a lot of these indications, and really trying to then provide the real-world evidence for both safety monitoring but also persistence. It's a big question that the field still has, is how long are these going to persist on the T-cell side and some of the other programs that are represented here. So that's going to be an interesting thing to see play out over time.
And I think, Jeff, you couple that with how sick some of these patient populations are, which makes it particularly challenging to get safety signals in a population that's not pristine, like we see in some other diseases.
Sure, absolutely.
I think, Maria, the point you raised is a really good one. I would say if we, have several dozen companies coming to us each year, many of them have not taken advantage of that meeting and have made some assumptions, or maybe they've gotten some outside guidance, but there's nothing like getting it from the horse's mouth.
I agree.
I think that's really good advice on your part. Before we turn it over to the audience, just one last topic I wanted to throw out to the panel. So if you look at the Novartis and the Gilead products, they've now commercially been available. I think August 30th was the Kimra anniversary, and a little bit shorter time period for the other one. But does the commercial uptake influence what you're thinking right now? I'm always struck, if you look at those two companies with multi-billion-dollar revenues, it's always striking that each quarter they have to tease out this particular product, which is almost a rounding error in the context of the company's revenue as a whole, but is so critically important to our field. How do you, the four of you, do you look at those sales each quarter? Does that influence anything that you're thinking about what you're doing? I think the audience would be interested in views on that.
I do. Every quarter I look to see Gilead's balance sheets are a little easier to read rather than Novartis's, so we certainly looked at their forecast and we looked at what their actual sales were. Also, when the acquisition was completed, a number of the SEC documents became available that showed, and again, John Milligan talked about it very extensively, CEO of Gilead, about the fact that the product was being launched in about 10 hospitals, and over the course of a year, they were going to up to about 70 hospitals. So I definitely monitored their footprint, how they're expanding their footprint. Are they able to keep up with the projection that they had quarter over quarter? And if I remember correctly, sales beat their own expectations, both first quarter and second quarter. So I was encouraged when I see that, and I also see that their uptake in the hospital setting is increasing. That tells me that the infrastructure within the hospitals is a solvable problem. Because they initially, when they came out, they were very worried about, is there enough ICU rooms? And with our products, we don't need ICU rooms, but it is important to know whether the hospital staff, the support staff, is there and well trained. So it was very reassuring for me to see that the product was taken up well, on schedule, on plan, and the expansion was going well. So not only the numbers were hitting it, but the delta of growth was hitting it. So that was reassuring for me. Yeah.
Thank you.
Of course. I don't know.
We have a unique perspective with regard to Novartis because we license them some intellectual property that they use for the Kymriah. So we are getting a check from them. So we get a sense of what their revenues are in a different way. But I would say the few things that we're watching is just the execution side in particular, how well they're executing against the business. What are the things that they're doing well? What are the things they're slipping up on? And really focusing on those areas for us as we think about the commercial world, both in our severe genetic disease business and then with Celgene on a potential launch of a product into the multiple myeloma world. I think it also echoes some of the stuff we were talking about before. Invest heavily in the systems early to make sure that it's as smooth as it possibly can be. We're not all going to be perfect in our launches by any stretch, and we know that. But if you're investing heavily with the COEs, with the patient and the family at the center of it, that's what's going to cause us to succeed long term. And I think the only other thing is clearly the market is open for business as it relates to creative ways of access. And so that's the other heartening thing, that they're listening. Now, whether we can drive that through is, I think, incumbent upon us to continue to get creative, to continue to push to see the system change such that we can get broad access in a fair and reasonable way with all the constituents involved and stakeholders. I know it's a very generic statement, but it's good to see that they're open to being creative. And I think we all have to take that and drive hard because there's a moment in time right now to take advantage of, feels like.
Yeah, I agree with both Jeff and Maria. And I'll maybe bring up something that came up in one of the conversations I was having earlier today, which is a good reminder that thanks to this commercial rollout, and actually thanks to some of the original trials that Novartis and Kite sponsored, they've done a lot of the hard work of going into these hospitals, into these settings, and training the providers, training people all across the hospital system, which we will all benefit now from. These are clinicians who have hands-on experience and much more comfort with this entire modality of therapy. And so these commercial launches, not only are we watching the numbers and trying to understand what's happening from a commercial perspective, but the reality of how that's changing these providers' comfort with these therapies will open doors for all of us as well.
It's an interesting point you bring up, Rachel. On the research side, we've seen a huge demand for these few dozen hospitals. And I think it's going to be a very interesting intersection, especially when multiple products, one being commercial and one being research studied, is to how do these hospitals view, which patient should be pushed down one path and maybe one educated more about another path, depending on payers, depending on condition, things like that. But it's certainly a unique situation when there's just a handful of centers in each country that really have the infrastructure and the expertise. Now, obviously, it's best for everybody if that can be expanded, but at least right now, it's a lot of competition for a few places.
Yeah.
Any other comments? Any other topics the panel wants to lead us to before we open it up to the audience?
I just want to echo on something that you had said earlier today. The expedited timelines does have a downside. And I cannot sleep thinking, how are we going to take our product to market? Because that infrastructure that you have to build, that normally in a regular drug development, back in the days, the drug development from IND to NDA was around 10 years. Yeah. Then we got into antivirals, and that became more like 6 years. And then we pushed the envelope in oral oncology products, and we could do it in 4.5 years maybe. And now we're looking at even shorter time frame. So what it does is that the time to prepare for the market doesn't get any shorter. It's typically about 1.5 to 2 years on the short side. So what it does is we wait until very last minute to make sure that our product is acceptable. We have agreement with FDA, EMA may be on board, and it now leaves us in a position of, oh my goodness, we now have to build a commercial organization. We didn't do anything about it. So it's an awesome problem to have, but it is nerve-wracking. So there is a downside to shortening the timeline.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, and I personally think it'll be interesting to see if those timelines stay that way as more and more products move in and through the clinic as to whether or not, as you know, in some fields or therapeutic areas, we've seen where there's an initial decrease in timelines, and then as second generation products come through, there just isn't the infrastructure at FDA or other places to be able to handle it. So.
You're correct. It probably will change, and the landscape will ultimately change. I agree.
I think one thing that's interesting, Maria, in this field, and we certainly have been in drug development on the panel here and in the audience for decades, but I think sometimes we think that we're doing things from the beginning and inventing it all over again, whereas the history you just ascribe to those different timelines is really good. As I feel like in some cases we talk, especially with early stage companies with tremendous enthusiasm and great technology, but the history's not there of just drug development in general, of what are the minefields that you're going to be crossing.
Yep.
Not unique to cell and gene therapy, just in general to getting any drug through the pathway.
Totally agree. Yeah.
We've got a little bit less than 10 minutes or so left, so comments, questions from the audience for the panel. I think we've got a microphone in the back there.
We put them all to sleep.
It's a quiet group.
Or answered all their questions.
Yeah.
Sure.
By the end of the second day, right? How many times can you do?
All right, it's coming at you. You're going to need to stand.
Whoa,
Wow.
Well done.
Okay,
good catch.
no idea. Oh, it doesn't.
There you go.
Fantastic discussion. I just wanted to maybe take that thought about the, if you like, the impact on the healthcare delivery infrastructure a little further, and just ask the panel. Obviously, if you look at the number of potential products coming through the pipeline, and let's put aside the affordability question just for 1 minute, and then just look at the potential impact across multiple therapy areas in health delivery in terms of the change required, and the both in the infrastructure and the impact on, you know, existing services, which may become redundant in some instances. I just wondered what the panel's view on what the industry's role in kind of facilitating that change might be, because it's difficult to see how an individual company can do that. That strikes me as that there's a more holistic effort required there.
Anybody want to take the first crack at that?
I'm just trying to make sure I understood the question. Are you asking that there is a lot of new products coming, and how are we coordinating ourselves as sort of drug developers and bringing these products to the market? Is that what you're asking?
No, it's building on the thought that what are the limitations to adoption? And if the limitations to adoption at the moment are, we're not seeing that, the delivery, the health care delivery infrastructure it's accommodating things. But if you look at the tidal wave of products coming through, whether that will remain the case is the question, and whether the healthcare delivery part of the value chain can adjust quickly enough to accommodate the products coming through. Let's park the affordability question for the moment, because that may actually be the biggest block. But you know, if you took haemophilia for instance, you know, if all of those products are successful and come through, it makes lots of the current infrastructure redundant potentially, which means, you know, that change has to be managed by somebody.
I get it, and I think I have a very good answer for you. It's the law of natural selection. We had multiple statins reach the market within a course of a very short period of time, right? Ultimately, the physicians decide what is their favorite product and what works in their hand best. So it's a good day when physicians have multiple choices in treating their patients. Ultimately, there's going to be differences between products that come to market, and that by itself prioritizes itself out. In my past life, I worked on BTK inhibitors twice. The first one and then the second one. Both of them are in the market right now. So how does a physician decide which BTK inhibitor? One has a certain safety profile, the other one has a different safety profile. So they look at their patient and they say, does this patient tolerate the first one better or the second one better? So it's not exactly as controlled, I think, as drug developers, as none of us form some sort of a backdoor, you know, meeting room where we go together and we decide how we're going to do it. But the market decides where the equilibrium is. So I think, at least for me, that's...
No, I think you're exactly right. It's the law of economics, and, you know, America's an amazing place, and if there's good efficacy in a product and the infrastructure's not there, they will build it.
Yeah.
And the people will get trained, and the physicians are very keen on these types of new therapies.
One thing I was thinking of when I heard that question is, it sort of triggered me in a sideways thought, but, you know, historically in drug development and drug early launch commercialization, you have the early adopters. And I'll be curious to see in this field, do the early adopters then move on to the second generation products and the third generation, or do they have the affinity for the first ones and then ultimately see the safety and efficacy advantages, the cost advantages, et cetera, or are they just always jumping to the next product because that's what they do?
Some early adopters are just that. They're very good at adopting very quickly and early. And frankly, I think they really open doors for clinicians who are late adopters. So the early adopters are the ones who are willing to take the risk. They're willing to try, and they make a difference in the marketplace. Everybody has a role in this. The early adopters bring the new product in, but the late adopters are the ones that are going to sit and watch and see which one is a better product for the patients. I think there's a role for everybody. It ultimately, law of economics is a very good way of saying it. It ultimately settles into an equilibrium that everybody has options, which is a good thing from my perspective.
And we're starting to see some of that investment already play out because of the magnitude of the effect of some of these programs and the realization from the market that more are coming. Just to your point, that there's a lot in the pipeline coming through. We're seeing it in Europe, where you've got institutions investing very heavily in transplant facilities because they either want to be prepared for the volume that they expect coming down the pike, and to be a center of excellence for travel from international countries into Europe. And they want to be seen as the world leader in cell and gene therapy from an institutional and delivery perspective. So it's going to take some time, and you're right, you're going to have some that lead the way and some that follow. But we're already starting to see that type of investment because of the exact things that you're pointing out, that it's going to become real pretty fast.
Time for another question?
Looks like up front here.
Yes.
Nice, easy toss.
Thank you. Really enjoyed the panel. Too close. So thank you, everybody. I really also enjoyed the conversation around manufacturing and all of your respective perspectives on the challenges there. And it sounds like there is an issue with scale, right? But I'm curious, this is a very simple question, I think, but do you also see, are there particular gaps in the manufacturing process coming up for each of you and your respective products? Something you're concerned about might be an acute block?
I seem to be the first to go all the time, huh? Yes, definitely. Suppliers, there's a lot of single source suppliers, and this is the nature of cell therapy. So someone who had specific vessels, reagents, these are biological, so there's not a ton of them. And then the fact that as a sponsor, we're responsible for our own line of supply. I come from a small molecule background, right? So last time when we were doing small molecules, we would take the structure and we would go to a CMO and say, make this. We're not going to tell them where to buy triethylamine from, where to buy your ethanol from. You don't do that. You don't have to do that. Figure it out. Go buy yourself wherever you want. Here, this is very different. We have to now be very vigilant about our own supply all the way down to the source. We have to figure out who has it, how much, when, how to release it. We have to release it. So there's a lot of complexity that goes around cell therapy. And I think those are the reasons that the cost is high. That contributes to that factor. So there is limitations. It still has a long way to go before we can just take the cell and say, okay, CMO X, make this cell for me. We're still a long way away. But we are making progress. And again, I'm pleased to see that there's now multiple supply chains that are becoming available and people are coming into this space. It's a growth area, like any other growth area from my perspective. I don't know what
That is an excellent answer, because I wasn't thinking about it, but you jarred my memory. But there's certain very specialized equipment and tools that sometimes are just not in supply. And in fact, we order a lot of excess material ahead of time to make sure that we have an inventory. Mm-hmm. Sometimes it's like 2 years or 3 years of inventory, which is a big upfront cost. But we have to do it because we cannot have this delay or this roadblock that's holding us up from what we need to manufacture. But you really have to have this whole, I can't emphasize enough, and I said at the beginning, this whole process engineering down, and you really need to think about it from the very beginning and then think about it again and again and again and test it. It's just so critical in this business.
Yeah, I think right now there's just a significant disconnect between supply and demand across the entire cell and gene therapy space. And so I think long before we'll get to the previous question that was raised of really delivery being the bottleneck of delivering these new therapies to patients, I think ever manufacturing enough for these to make it through clinical trials will be the first bottleneck. looking at some of the timelines that providers are offering right now, the queues are long, are incredibly long. And when you think about some of these very sophisticated therapies that have a whole number of inputs, and you have to stitch them together from multiple sources, I think near term that's one of the biggest challenges for the field, certainly a big challenge for our organization.
Only thing to add to that are quality systems, making sure we invest heavily early in quality systems, and assay validation. So a lot of times forget about the assays that support all of these products, and they're many times new assays, potency assays and otherwise, that you've got to validate. So that's another big, I guess, lesson learned from our side, that really invest heavily in those at the right time, obviously.
Well, I think we've come to the end. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank the panel and thank everybody in the audience.